All right, so we're gonna read this. This is the preface. I'm not preface. This is a review of critical notes of The Rational Mind by Scott Sturgeon by Jane Friedman, called "Committed Neutrality in the Rationality in the Rational Mind," and this is in analysis. So, let me drop music. Scott Sturgeon's new book, The Rational Mind, brings together and expands on ideas he's been writing about for the past decade or so. At its core, this book is about the attitudes that are central to epistemology, what are often called the doxastic attitudes, and what Sturgeon calls epistemic attitudes. Part 1 of TRM, I guess that would be The Rational Mind, offers in-depth critical discussions of two central formal models of the doxastic attitudes. One fine-grained, Bayesianism, and one coarse-grained, AGM. For Sturgeon, each of these formal models something psychologically real. Bayesianism is a formal model of our states of confidence, doxastic attitudes that come in degrees or can be ranked or ordered in terms of strength, and AGM is a formal model of our non-degreed doxastic attitudes, specifically belief, disbelief, and suspension of judgment. This first part of the book fleshes out both models in detail and raises concerns about each. Part 2 of the TRM, The Rational Mind, is focused on the relationship between fine and coarse-grained doxastic attitudes. Sturgeon ultimately argues that coarse-grained doxastic attitudes are reducible to fine-grained ones. But crucially, these more fundamental, fine-grained confidences cannot be understood just as Bayesian point value subjective probabilities. Instead, Sturgeon proposes a new force-based model of confidence according to which we can understand degrees of confidence as built up from a mixture of what Sturgeon calls cognitive force. All right, immediately, from my metaphysical point of view in the world, this is screaming, you fucked up your Aristotle. You don't understand Aristotle, and therefore you have done something incredibly dumb. Now, why? Why would this happen? It's because you're putting the coarse grain on the fine grain. Sturgeon ultimately argues that coarse grain doxastic attitudes are reducible to fine grain ones. The chance of that actually being the case is low. Let me explain. You can't do you can't rely really big, there is no reductionism that makes a lot of sense. It's like you're saying, okay, how do you have these big ideas? Well, that just reduces to like the workings of your brain. Noticeably, we can't figure that sort of shit out. We've never been able to figure that sort of shit out. You have to go from a holistic concept to the more specific things. Basically, you can go back to your Aristotle. What comes first in the metaphysics? It is the arguments that how you know a thing is a thing. The metaphysics of an object, you have to talk about wholes first. And then once you have a whole thing, then you can talk about how it moves in degree. But you can't talk about the degrees before you have the object. This is the old joke. What's the face of the Cheshire Cat? The last thing you see is the grin. The joke there is that it doesn't make sense to have a grin without a face, because the cat disappears. You have to have the full cat before you can have the degrees to which the cat's face changes. So, ignoring the fact that cats may or may not be able to grin, but you can't, this is metaphysically confused to argue that coarse-grained attitudes, like things that are talking about wholes, can actually rely on things of degrees. Does the Cheshire Cat rely on the grin of the Cheshire Cat? That's the problem here. And so immediately this is screaming, I got problems with epistemology in general. I'm published on the fucking matter saying that I do some things differently. You can see it in the chat below. The bot is kind of still working under my name. But this is the thing. How do you actually do argue this kind of metaphysics? And no, I've never seen a high quality metaphysics arguing to put coarse-grained things on fine-grained bases. It's like it's like a spindly leg. Like the leg is all spindly, and then you're putting all the weight on top of it. The thing's gonna get knocked over. Yeah. Okay. At the start of, well, so immediately, but like this is part of the issue here. At the start of The Rational Mind, Sturgeon claims that the book does not aim to establish a single major hypothesis or perspective. While this may capture something true about Sturgeon's intentions, it is hard not to see the final few chapters of Sturgeon's force-based theory of the doxastic attitudes as the centerpiece of the book. Yeah, again, this is one of these things that you can say it, but it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why did you write a whole book if you're not going to establish anything? And if you actually write a whole book, you're going to have said something, unless you're really not in philosophy anymore. You're out. If you've moved out of philosophy, then you can like do different stuff, like saying you're doing a work in rhetoric, or just making something pretty. Then you may not have like a point outside of being pretty, but like you're not doing a single major hypothesis or perspective. If you're doing philosophy, you're going to put forward, at least a few hypotheses or perspectives. But like, yeah, maybe there's not one, but there's going to be some major ones. Okay, so that said, it is certainly true that the chapters that come before those final few, the ones that make up the bulk of the book, cannot be read as merely setting the stage for what's to come. Sturgeon says that a major goal of TRM is to provide something useful for budding undergraduates, his colleagues working in epistemology, and everyone in between. Amazingly, he has managed to pull this off. Okay, see, that's interesting. So the major goal is to give, it's more of a survey. All right, fine. I actually have a beef with the author here, because they could have just said that was the major point. It's like, if he says the major point is to do this and not to have like an overarching theory of epistemology, I mean, that's okay. Much of my discussion of TRM will focus on part 2 of the book, and in particular the account of suspension of judgment that emerges there. Before getting there, though, I want to say a little bit about part 1. Part 1 consists of 6 chapters, about 2/3 of the book. In this part of the book, we get chapters that introduce both Bayesianism and the AGM model in ways that are largely appropriate for even beginner epistemologists. People more familiar with these theories will find the expected parts and their relations, which is not to say that they won't find any new insights. Those familiar with Sturgeon's work will find some of the usual Sturgeonian elements, novel diagrams, imaginative examples, and ways of talking about these models that you simply will not find in anyone else's work. Well, that's very nice to say about a philosopher. Look, this is nice. You don't always get nice things in philosophy. This is something very nice. These are largely meant to help the beginner, but Sturgeon's unique creative vision meant that I turned things over in new and unexpected ways too. In the early parts of the book, Chapter 4 stood out for me as one of the most philosophically rich discussions of Bayesian updating I've read, digging into its relation to inference and basing, and the somewhat strange rigidity of conditional credence. Yeah, well, conditional credence is hard. I could argue about Bayesianism, but in Bayesianism, you have to start off with like a certain starting out like credence, and so the idea that you're updating it is like it's fine, but then like what is this condition that you're updating? Like what is conditional credence? Okay. These early chapters display Sturgeon's commitment to a model of our doxastic states that accurately represent the facts on the ground. In the introduction, he takes what he calls the matching model's assumption to be a starting point for the discussion to come. This assumption says a formal model of rationality is fully acceptable only if it matches its target domain. And one of his main complaints about both the Bayesian and the AGM models is that they do not match their target domains, specifically fine-grained doxastic attitudes for the former and coarse-grained doxastic attitudes for the latter. For instance, one of Sturgeon's main gripes with the Bayesian model is that it models all of our degrees of confidence as credences, precise point-value subjective probabilities. But, he argues, our degrees of confidence aren't always nearly so precise. Besides our precise point-value degrees of belief, the ones we have in, for example, propositions where precise point-value chances are known, we also have less precise levels of confidence, what Sturgeon calls thick confidence. Yes, thick. If I know that the chance that some event E will occur is between 80 and 90%, then I will, or at least should, be 80 to 90% sure that E will occur. These thick confidences are not credences strictly so called. Sturgeon reserves credence for point value probabilities. Since standard Bayesianism only models credences, it fails to match its target domain. I mean, this seems a little nitpicky, but I guess. Like, if if you're gonna think about stuff in terms of credences, I mean, of course I'm taking what this author Friedman says of Sturgeon. That's exactly what I was thinking about, Bo. That's exactly what I had in mind. But like, that's the thing. It's like, if you're only allowing a certain like exact point of credence in your belief, then you're missing the point of like what's going on. Like the idea that it needs an exact number. It's like all confidences are in some sense thick. Like there's always going to be some error bars on this. You don't care about the little, you just care that they, they are, you care that it's there. You don't really care about the exact shape of your credence, Like it just matters that like you're somewhere in the ballpark. And so the idea that like people are going to be hung up about exact point values is a little silly. But like, and so the idea that like we're taking the exact point value when you just got to be nearby is like, I find that a little like again backwards. It's wrong-headed here. If you're going to think about this stuff, you're going to think that like, you need a probability credence, like a degree of belief, like 80 to 90%. You could say 85% on the exact, but then like at the end we're going to have like 5% error bars, and and then whatever, and so you give it something right in the middle, but then you add the error bars in at the end. It's like it seems like this could just be fixed in some sort of technical way, but like that's kind of odd. I'm sure they've thought of this. This can't, like, I'm not being clever here, but I just find it funny that, like, it should be obvious that no one actually has an exactly 85.0237646% credence in anything. That doesn't make sense. That's not how people think at all. Okay. Sturgeon's discussion of suspension of judgment begins in chapter 6 when he turns his focus to the AGM model. Finding a model of our doxastic attitudes that gets suspension of judgment right is a major theme of the book, and Sturgeon touts the account of suspension of judgment that his force-based model provides as one of its major benefits. The AGM model, Sturgeon claims, marks no difference between suspending judgment in P and failing both to believe and to disbelieve P. Alright, so this is a form of bracketing in the old Husserlian sense, where you have to say, I'm not going to believe it, I'm not going to disbelieve it, I'm just going to suspend judgment, and see if we can objectively evaluate this sort of thing. Okay, he finds this an unacceptable result. Suspending judgment is not the absence of belief and disbelief, it is the presence of a proprietary kind of neutral commitment, something more than a mere absence or lack. Excuse me. Suspending judgment is the propositional attitude of committed neutrality. All right, so this is where we're getting somewhere, because like this is what like I was just saying, Husserl was saying with his bracketing in his you need to step back from the world, you need to sort of evaluate things neutrally, and that's what his bracketing is. So they're not he didn't call it suspension of judgment, it was bracketing back in the day, but like yeah. So but I'm not so sure like what exactly it means that you're failing both to believe and disbelieve something. I mean, exactly what is the content of P actually in that point? You're thinking about something, but like, what are you believing and disbelieving about it? So, I don't know. Alright, Sturgeon started using the phrase committed neutrality to describe the attitude of suspending judgment in 2009. Since then, it has appeared in a number of discussions of suspension of judgment, including the authors. While the phrase has captured some imaginations and has been a helpful organizing idea in thinking about suspension of judgment as compared to the mere lack of any belief, especially, as McGrath 2021 shows, there are many ways of being neutral and even many ways of being committedly neutral. Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm saying. The bracketing is just an old term for this, I've heard. It is not clear that these all count as ways of suspending judgment or being agnostic, at least not if we're using those terms in ways we typically do in and outside of philosophy. Yeah, no one uses bracketing outside of philosophy, but like this is just how I think about it. One of the questions I want to address here is whether the sort of Sturgeonian committed neutrality that emerges from TRM, the book, aligns well with either our pre or post theoretic accounts of suspension of judgment. Yeah. Sturgeon's main reason for rejecting the AGM model's identification of suspension of judgment with a mere lack of belief is a familiar one. Lack of belief is extremely easy to come by, but suspension of judgment takes more work. For instance, if S lacks some concept C, then they won't have any C involving beliefs, but that won't mean they'll have suspending judgments about the relevant C involving issues. The latter seems to require something more or different. For Sturgeon, we only suspend judgment on some matter when we make a particular kind of doxastic commitment with respect to that matter, a neutral doxastic commitment. In one sense, then, suspension of judgment is importantly akin to believing and disbelieving for Sturgeon. Yeah, I mean, look, this, you could give I don't know what they were saying about this, but basically you can think of like a menu in front of you, and you can a whole bunch of like what look like very good options. You can say, all right, what do I want? And you know what all the options are. And so it's not like you don't have any belief in any of them. You have lots of belief in all of them, but like you don't have any particular belief like at any of them. You're going in thinking they're all good. You already know what they are, and you're sitting there deciding. So you're suspending your like this committed neutrality. You go in saying, I'm not gonna prejudge what I want to eat. Basically, I'm gonna sit there and read them. I'm gonna know what they all are and then decide. This is not that far away from like an everyday occurrence, though. So it's it's like, but it isn't that you don't know what's on the menu ahead of time. You do get to read the menu like after you read the menu, then you decide. But you don't decide before you read the entire menu. Okay. He describes believing as a settled endorsement, disbelieving as a settled denial, and suspending judgment as a settled neutrality. Crucially, suspension of judgment is or involves a committed neutrality rather than a mere de facto neutrality, say due to conceptual lack. Yeah, I mean, if you don't know what's on the menu, then you can't, that's just indifference, principle of indifference. You give it you give everything equal credence because, it's just easier to deal with that way. You say, I don't know what it is, so everything's the same. More generally, part of what emerges in part 1 of The Rational Mind is a case for what Sturgeon calls intra-level anti-reductionism. With respect to the coarse-grained attitudes, the conclusion is that none of belief, disbelief, or suspending judgment is more basic than its coarse-grained cousins. And in part 2 of The Rational Mind, the focus shifts to thinking about the interlevel case. Do coarse-grained doxastic attitudes reduce to the fine-grained ones? Sturgeon argues that the answer is yes. Alright, so I'm not entirely sure, like, just the idea of belief reduces to what? The belief that, something is good or tasty? It's like, yeah, I don't know. I want to make one point about the dialectic here before moving on to a discussion of part 2, author says. One very helpful distinction Sturgeon makes in The Rational Mind is between confidence and credence, where credence, as far as I understand, is being reserved for a very specific kind of confidence, a point value subjective probability. Opening up this space between confidence and credence naturally leads one to wonder about entirely non-probabilistic ways of modeling confidences. Maybe our rational degrees of belief aren't the sorts of things that should be modeled with anything like probability functions. Unfortunately, The Rational Mind does not take up this question. Yeah, this is a good question I think the author is raising here. If you're going to say that we have confidences that are not the same as credences, then we've got two things going on in our head. The credence being exactly probabilistic, how likely something is you think, versus confidence in that, which is something else here. I don't know what that is. The discussion in part 2 of the relationship between the different kinds of doxastic attitudes is largely a discussion of the relationship between subjective probabilities on the one hand and belief, disbelief, and suspension of judgment on the other. Of course, there's plenty to say about this relationship, and Sturgeon's discussion is excellent, but a possibility I thought had been opened up in part 1 seemed closed at the start of part 2, as subjective probabilities take center stage rather than a more general kind of possibly non-probabilistic fine-grained confidence. Given the extent to which Sturgeon frames the rational mind as answerable to our actual psychologies, this felt like a bit of a missed opportunity to me. And I think the author is onto something here, especially if Sturgeon is claiming, as the author said in the first part, that, there's these thick confidences. And so it's things that don't show up as exactly what, a probably like an 85% chance in your head. I mean, there's a lot of things that you might say, might work out, might not work out, but you don't have a great idea. And so that sort of not exactly modeled idea, like that feels more of a human thing than to have something exactly exactly nailed at a certain probability. Yeah, you always, and people have asked me this before, like on stream. It might even, like when we were discussing the how to read philosophy. And this is one of these things, and this is one of the reasons I actually read these critical notice, because you're reading something about someone else's reading. It's like, what exactly are the examples here? The author is praising the examples that Sturgeon gives, but does not mention them here because, you know, those are the details. But exactly, if something is answerable to our actual psychology, then you have to ask, what are the actual examples that they're using? And if it's answerable to your actual psychology, there is no one I know, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, that can put an exact numerical value on what they believe something, like the chance of something that they don't know is going to happen to be. Like, I'm sitting here right now. You can put a probability of 1 on that, like 100%. After that, everything else, I don't have any good number. Like, I know what I'm doing right now. I think, therefore I am. I can say I exist at this moment. That's probability 1. Everything else in this world is not probability 1. That's it. You can just pull out your Descartes, and then after that, you know, ain't so clear and distinct. Okay, so yeah, what is our actual psychology then? Like, what are these things that we are talking about? It's hard. It gets real hard to say. Okay, part 2 of The Rational Mind explores the vexed issue of the relationship between belief, disbelief, and suspension of judgment on the one hand and credence on the other. Here, Sturgeon makes some familiar moves. For example, he lays out a standard threshold view, goes into detail about problems that the lottery and the preface pose for such a view. That's the paradox of the preface, and I assume, because that's what we're talking about, lottery and preface in the same sentence, and rejects various extreme reactions to those puzzles. But in this part of The Rational Mind, Sturgeon also makes some truly novel moves with potentially far-reaching consequences. For example, he sketches an entirely new model of confidences. According to this force-based view, all types of confidence point value subjective probability, that is credence, interval valued subjective probability, that is sharp thick confidence, mushy credence, that is vague thick confidence, are all built from mixtures of what we'll call cognitive force. With this new model of fine-grained doxastic attitudes in hand, Sturgeon argues that coarse-grained doxastic attitudes are indeed reducible to fine-grained ones. Okay, so here's the reduction argument. The author is made something up called cognitive force, and then was able to, you know, with all the different forces, multiply the ontology, and then get all your and in doing so, got all the different kinds of things that they want out of this. Is this a good idea? No, like, this is clever. So, like, in some sense, I did not see if this was gonna work. Let's find out. Like, if you have, like, 3 things, you know, let's see, is this going to do anything? It does not. Why did it not do anything today? There we go. So if, like, you've got, like, yeah, here we go. So if you've got, like, you know, like, something like here, something like here, and then, like, something like here, like, we've got a triangle, we've got a circle, and a square, and you've got, like, a little bit of overlap. You can ask, like, all right, so, like, you can multiply, like, is there a triangle, actually, so let's do it this way, and then you can go, like, I can't draw because I'm not good at drawing. Okay, so basically you can see that there's, like, it gets darker in the middle. And so this is what it is. It's like you've got stuff that's, like, over here in the circle, you got stuff over here in the square, and then you got stuff over here in the triangle. And between this fine-grained stuff, you can get the overlaps. And when things overlap in certain ways, you can see, like, right over, like the spot, like, Like over here, it's kind of dark, but like then up here, it's like very dark. And like, so you can say, all right, so these overlaps are these big objects and these things. Of course, you have to have all this, like these, like you have to have the, what's it called? You know, the triangle, the square and the circle, and you have to have them overlapping. So you've got like these like superstructures, and these are going to be whatever I assume the different forces are here. Because there's no other way you're going to get like single objects out of like multiple objects. Like combining things doesn't really, I mean, this is metaphysics. Combining things doesn't actually make sense. Taking things apart doesn't actually make sense. It's a lot harder to combine things and take things apart than you realize when you're talking about metaphysics. So, like, this is the thing. How do you build stuff up? Well, you don't. You have to take parts of smaller things and then claim those are the big things. You can do this. Like, you can see that, like, you know, in the middle of a Venn diagram, you can say like the center part of the Venn diagram, but you have to have already built a lot of structure into it. And that's where you're going to get into these troubles, because like you're going to have like, you know, it's just not going to make sense. I mean, basically that's what it's going to come down to. Can I select things? I have not used this overlay in so long that I am unbelievably, can I just do this and then drag this? Oopsie. I don't know if I can do this anymore. That does not work. I want the move tool. Yes, I want the move tool. Yeah. All right. So keep this in mind. All right. So here's what we got. We've got like different things with overlap, and we're pointing at the different overlaps here. And I think that's what's going on. Okay, so let's find out if there's anything there. But like, again, this is, again, it's a sleight of hand to say you're reducing the singular to the many. But like, again, you can do it, I guess. But you have to keep a picture like this in mind. You really have some very big things going on in the background. And then you're saying, well, it reduces down to the simple. But again, you need the big things. Okay. So continuing, there's so many rich discussions in this section part of the rational mind, but I want to largely focus on one key thread: Sturgeon's discussion of suspension of judgment. Sturgeon calls the view that belief, disbelief, and suspension of judgment are reducible to credence's creedal-based Lockeanism. Wow. All right, that's a great title, creedal-based Lockeanism. CBL. According to CBL, belief is nothing more than sufficiently strong credence, disbelief is nothing more than sufficiently weak credence, and suspended judgment is nothing more than middling strength credence. And now do you see what I did with three, like a circle, the square, and the triangle? You've got sufficiently strong, you've got sufficiently weak, and middling strength credence. And so these are different kinds of layers in like you've got a high, middle, low. So you've got like a, you know, circle, square, triangle kind of credence. That's basically what we've done here. And like I told you, there is only so many ways to do this. Like, it just doesn't work otherwise. Sturgeon has a number of plausible objections to CBL, as well as some nice defenses of the view against some others. But one of his main complaints is about its handling of suspension of judgment. Yet something in the middle is going to be very hard to defend. According to CBL, one suspends judgment in P if and only if one has middling credence in P. Personally, I don't love the locution suspends judgment in P, but I will follow Sturgeon's preferred construction in this discussion. I agree with Sturgeon that this sort of account of suspension of judgment doesn't work. Sturgeon's main worry is different from mine, though. Sturgeon's concern here is largely with the sort of attitudinal precision this view entails. Take some proposition about which one has little evidence either way. Sturgeon's example is the proposition V, that there is a foul-smelling vinegar factory in Slough. I have no idea if this is true, maybe though. So I suspend judgment. But, Sturgeon argues, I do not invest any precise credence in V. Why would I? I have no real evidence either way and nothing that would tell me in favor of such precision about V. So we have a counterexample to CBL, since in this case I suspend in V but do not have a middling credence in V. Okay, now I want to slap people. The history of probability goes back through something called the principle of indifference. The principle of indifference states that when you do not know what something is, you assign everything the same value. Everything has an exactly equal value. So if there's 2 options, everything gets 50-50. If there's 3 options, everything gets 1/3, etc. And then like everything you can, make it a little bit more complex. If something has exactly 2/3, and you give that exactly 2/3 and the one thing 1/3, but like then you can break it up differently. But like this is the idea, it's that this is the default idea. And so the idea that like what they're complaining about here is that you don't actually do this. No one thinks in terms of probabilities either, but like that's the default view. And so the idea that you have a counterexample here is just denying the principle of indifference, which goes back 300 years. Now, that's fine. I don't love the principle of indifference, but it's the idea that you have a counterexample to the case is it's a little bit of a misunderstanding of how people treat probability. No one likes the principle of indifference, but this is what we say happens. Now you're saying, well, that doesn't happen. That's not good enough in this case. Like it just isn't. You can say, all right, fine, but there are many arguments along these lines. Like you have to go look at the history of probability. That's just the problem. You have to look at what people said here. Just saying, oh, well, we don't do that. It's like, yeah, I know you don't do that, but people have said a lot of things about this. Okay. This said, so authors complain here. But alright, this said, Sturgeon does ultimately want to say that suspending judgment is a matter of having some degree or kind of confidence, as is believing and disbelieving. But we need to turn to his force-based account of confidence to understand how this reduction works. According to Sturgeon's force-based account of the doxastic attitudes, there are 3 main kinds of cognitive force. Thank you, look, please, like, don't break all your stuff. So again, there have to be 3 main accounts. Like this is why I did circle, triangle, and square. Like it's just like this is the sort of crap that happens. It's not that complicated actually. There are 3 kinds of cognitive force: attraction, repulsion, and neutrality. He compares these cognitive forces to gustatory forces. Some foods attract us, some repel us, and some we're neutral about. So you could say indifferent to, like at this point. Instead of neutral, you could just call it indifferent. So you could have like an indifferent status to some things. These gustatory forces come in degrees. For example, we find some foods strongly repulsive, others just a bit, and our disposition towards some foods can be a manifestation of some combination of these. For example, some attraction, but also a bit of repulsion. Same for people, for that matter. For Sturgeon, cognitive forces are akin to these sorts of gustatory forces. Some claim P. We can be drawn attracted to P, so Canada is bigger than Hawaii, or repelled by P. All palm trees should be cut down, or neutral about P. The Sonoran Desert is about twice the size of the Mojave Desert. Yeah, I don't know what the desert size is, so that's fair, I don't know. Sturgeon's proposal is, first, that levels of confidence, all of them sharp, thick, interval, fuzzy, mushy, are nothing but stable configurations of cognitive force. So this is the overlapped parts in my little diagram down there. All right, so that's what we're talking about. Those are the stable configurations, like where these things are like together. That's where you're sort of overlapping on these cognitive forces. And second, that once we adopt this force-based account of confidence, we can more easily reduce belief, disbelief, and suspension of judgment to confidence as well. The resulting view is what Sturgeon calls force-based Lockeanism. According to force-based Lockeanism, belief, disbelief, and suspension of judgment are also nothing but configurations of cognitive force. This force-based account of our doxastic lives is drawn out in a couple of chapters in The Rational Mind. This means it's not much more than a sketch, and there are plenty of questions about the picture the reader may have. But as a sketch, it is certainly intriguing and is bound to leave a reader wanting to think more about it and see how the details might be worked out. No, I have no desire. I already know, like, that's what it looks like. It's like you've got these 3 things, they overlap, and wherever you got, like, the Venn diagram, like, center bit, that's that's what you get. And then, it's a little bit more complicated, but like, that's all it comes down to for me. Okay, anywho, in touting the virtues of force-based Lockeanism, in particular, Sturgeon says that it can give a much better story about suspended judgment than its creedal-based cousin. I'm not sure this is right. It doesn't seem to me that FBL falls short It seems to me that FBL falls short in a similar sort of way to CBL. It doesn't account for an important range of cases in which subjects are suspending judgment. The case that FBL doesn't capture are different from the ones that CBL doesn't, but neither seems to me to be getting the ranges of cases we want covered right, quite right. What does FBL say about suspension of judgment? To get there, we should first see what Sturgeon's force-based account has to say about the fine-grained doxastic attitudes and in particular, how it models credences versus thick credences. Recall, credences are precise point value subjective probabilities, and thick credences and thick confidences are not. While Sturgeonian thick confidence is a novel pre-theoretic construction, it is closely related to some familiar elements in the contemporary Bayesian epistemology, mushy, imprecise interval value credence. Sturgeon's thick confidence is a bit more expansive than these others, but it's worth making clear that the archetype of thick confidence in TRM is confidence spread out over a subinterval of 0 to 1. So what does the force-based account say about credence and thick confidence? Sturgeon says, quote, our proposal is that credence is the result of mixing attraction, repulsion, and neutrality in a way that involves no neutral force. Put another way, each grade of credence involves a level of neutrality that is literally nothing mixed with blends of other cognitive force. We further propose that this is what sets credence apart from thick confidence. The latter involves zero neutrality potentially mixed with blends of other cognitive force. Okay, so this is like the alpha level. Like, all right, so one of these is like in computers and on the internet, you get like a hex value. There's a numerical value for all the colors that you see on the screen. So like this blue I have here, it has a particular number value, and like so what happens is basically my computer has a number. I set the number in there. It tells blue, and then that blue is transmitted across the in the video format to all you folks out there. The issue is, okay, like you can also then, the color is one thing, but then how bright it is, you can like make it, more or less light or dark. That's the alpha value. And so I guess they're treating the neutrality as sort of like this alpha value. You have the value of like what you're thinking, but then exactly how like bright and how salient it is comes off in like this secondary value, which is the neutrality, how neutral you are about it. So like this is the thought, but then furthermore how much it is. And so once you have the thought, then it's kind of exact, but like the thick ones are this sort of like how bright or how like dim it is. I mean, it kind of makes some sense here, but again, it's a lot of structure to get something that we don't have in our heads. Like this is a lot of metaphysics. You have to be making up forces in your heads to make this account work. It's like, yeah, this is more complicated than like what if you believe in something, you don't think that it's like a admixture of what am I saying? We're back to the fucking humors here, folks. This is the humors. Like, these are the humors. Oh, everything's gonna break now. Good. Great. Let's try this again. But yeah, so we're back to humors. This is a humor theory where you've got these different sorts of, Alright, whatever. Stream Deck decided it was gonna crash. But yeah, so we're in a humor theory. Oh, where'd my diagram? Okay, it's there. Okay, diagram's working. So yeah, that's where we're at. We've just gone back to the 1800s, which is fine, to tell you the truth. But like, it's force-based theory, but it's a humor-based theory. You have like bile, black bile, blood, not like the real blood, and melancholy. And these are the different forces. They had a four-based one. This person has a three-based thing. But like, this is what mixes in your head to give you thoughts. Congratulations. Lucifero, what's up? Hey, well, thanks for stopping by. Appreciate it. Appreciate all the lurks and everything like that. Like, it's appreciated. Hope you're having a great night. And hope your sleeps go well, too. Why are we not working, Stream Deck? What do we got? Let's just give a click. Let's see. Yellow bile. That's right. It was not black bile. I was confused. Why, Stream Deck, you got to crash? Oh, yeah, you're in... I've been trying to stream earlier, and I couldn't stream this afternoon. So, yeah, I was like, I'm losing all my European viewers when I stream at night, and I want to be able to get a few more European people here. So yeah, but thanks for being up and like hanging out for a bit. I appreciate that. Sleep well. So yeah. Yeah, I wanted to stream actually during the day again today, but there was some some other things I do, some of them broke, and I had to fix that. Like, had to get done, so. Oh, man, why is my stream deck going down? This is irritating. Well, try again in a bit. We'll find out. Alright, I don't need that for now. Alright, so continuing. Neutral cognitive force shows itself in degrees of confidence thickness. Yeah, so this is like the thickness here again is like, this is how bright your screen is if you want. The colors are all the same, but like the brightness goes up and down. If your level of confidence in P is a precise real number in the unit interval, then that level of confidence expresses or involves no neutral cognitive force at all. Alternatively, if your confidence in P is thick, then the degree of spread or thickness in your confidence is an expression of your degree of neutrality towards P. Yeah, so like your contrast has just gone down here on your screen. How neutral are you about P is expressed in how you spread out your confidence for how spread out your confidence for P is. When Sturgeon turns into fleshing out FBL, it is this very same neutrality that grounds suspension of judgment. Here is what he says about FBL's version of suspension of judgment. Oh, okay, that's fine. Quote, a good way to think of suspended judgment on this approach is by appeal to a thickness threshold. For every level of confidence, there will be an amount of thickness associated with that level, ranging from 0% with credence to 100 with fully thick confidence. We can say that suspended judgment is thick confidence that happens to be thick enough, just thick enough, you know? Just got to get over that like thickness hump. Just as Lockean say that belief is confidence that is strong enough and disbelief is confidence that is weak enough. On this force-based approach to suspended judgment, such judgments is thick confidence that involves proportionally enough neutrality to make the grade. Just as we have belief and disbelief making thresholds for confidence, then we have suspended judgment threshold too. Yeah, so if like you're over 50% brightness on the screen, then you are no longer, then you get out of the thick and you get into the precise. I mean, it's like that's what we're talking about here. So, dagnabbit, why'd this break? The former have to do with the strength and of the relevant attitude maker. The latter has to do with its level of thickness, that is, the relative proportion of reserve or neutrality involved in its constitution. Yeah, so you can have like contrast and brightness, but like what's on the screen, of course, doesn't change at all. But your contrast and brightness are how you feel about these things. But I could just as easily have said yellow bile and melancholy, and like that's what you have more yellow bile than you have then you believe it, and if you have more melancholy, then it's thick and you believe it, but like it's you're unsure in the exact amount. So it's like this is like these names are suggestive, but we're back into humor theory. Like that's literally what's going on with this. All right, did I read this already? Okay, no. So according to FBL, this force-based Lockeanism, S suspends judgment in P if and only if S's confidence in P is sufficiently thick. Yeah, Sturgeon also says that suspended judgment springs from stable mixtures of fucking hell. Stable mixtures. Like you can't get away from this here. Of cognitive force dominated by neutrality. Yes, so you've got a stable mixture of melancholy and yellow bile, but it's dominated by blood, or like the humor of blood. All right, so like this is like literally this is the sort of thought that's going on here. Sturgeon does not go into very much detail about the exact form of this neutral domination. Yeah, like come on, humor theory. But I think we can take the overall proposal to be this. Once thick confidence in P is sufficiently thick to make for suspended judgment in P, just in case the stable configuration of forces from which that thick confidence is built has proportionally more neutral force than either of the other forces. So yeah, again, just translate the amount of force into amount of humor, and you've got a humor theory here. And that's what we're doing. To understand this proposal, it will help to better understand how specific configurations of force or humor amount to specific confidences for Sturgeon. Say one's degree of attraction to P is A, and one's degree of repulsion from P is R, and one's degree of neutrality towards P is N. We can get from those forces to a confidence interval of LU as follows. L is equal to A divided by the amount A plus R plus N, and U is A plus N divided by A plus R plus N. So while we cannot read the raw strength of the various forces off a confidence interval, we can read the proportional strengths of those forces off of that interval. If we label those degrees of proportional forces A star, R star, and N star, we can say that A star is equal to L, R star is equal to 1 minus U, and N star is equal to U minus L. So again, like, we're talking about ratios of like forces, might as well be ratios of liquids here. That's all that's going on. You can think of like old theory of how we used to run things. These theories are not that old and they have never left us, but like you just don't see people, like, we dress them up with our fancy numbers, but like the kind of thought that's going on here is not anything that has not been around for thousands of years, really. Okay, and so now you can see why I said right from the beginning, you gotta be like, this violates Aristotle. This is the argument not between Aristotle and Plato. This is the argument between Aristotle and Galen back in ancient Greece. Like, this is the level of, like, we're talking about like different ways of dealing with people here, and that's fine. But like, this is like, you can immediately see that these are old arguments, and there's nothing like it's not like this is a novel sort of argumentation here. Okay, continuing. So if suspension of judgment always involves proportionally more neutral force than either pro or con force, then S's confidence in P amounts to the suspension of judgment in P if and only if so some things are greater than other things. So again, back to the diagram I have down there. So if you've got more of one than the other, then you get into the thing where, like, if you got more triangle and circle than like square, because the square is clearly less dark, then you get a certain kind of belief. And if it was the other way around, then you'd have maybe a suspended belief. But like, that's what it is. And you just add mixtures of like circle, square, and triangle force or humor, if you will. Okay, and given this, we can also say that if S's thick confidence is in that interval, then that thick confidence amounts to S's suspending judgment in P, just in the case where, you know, one of the triangle or whatever is too low or triangle is too high, then you suspend judgment even though you thought like, hey, I think this is like between like 30 and 40% chance, but like I just don't have enough belief in it, and so it might be there, but I'm going to suspend judgment on that. Okay. Even if one agrees with Sturgeon that suspension of judgment is a kind of committed neutrality, one might wonder whether it is this kind. One clear result is that S's having a sharp credence in P never amounts to S's suspending judgment in P. It's not just that we can suspend judgment despite having no sharp credence, as in the case of Sloe's vinegar factories, but that creedal precision is in a crucial sense not compatible with suspension of judgment. No one with a sharp credence in P is suspending judgment in P. So no one who has the expected credence that the fair coin will come up heads can suspend judgment about whether it will come up heads. Well, that's just saying, okay, if you have 100% confidence in circle, like in my little circle thing down there, like, then you can't say, well, then you're kind of doubting it. So once one of them goes all the way to 100, the other ones, you can't like overrule that. Okay, so no one who has the expected credence that the fair coin will come up heads can suspend judgment about whether it will come up heads. No one has a ticket in the lottery they know to be fair and they know to have X many tickets can suspend judgment about whether their ticket will win, no matter if X equals 2 or 20 or 20,000. So long as these ticket holders have the credences that match the known chances, they cannot be agnostic, in the Sturgeonian sense at least, about whether their ticket will win. Yeah, I mean, if you know the probabilities, then you know exactly what it is. If you think the probability is exactly something, like in the case of a lottery, you know how many tickets are sold, then like, yeah, that's exactly the thing. It doesn't, it's not going to change. But that's, again, begging the question about what sort of thing are we talking about here. All right, Continuing. And if we take Sturgeon's thought that suspending judgment in P requires that n star be alright, so a certain ratio of these things, then it isn't only those with sharp credences who cannot be agnostic. For instance, say that S has a thick confidence with the midpoint 0.5 in P. So they believe almost exactly half, or they believe half in a sort of a fuzzy way. Okay, so then you're not suspending judgment P, because if you're better than like 1/3 or whatever, you're still over the threshold. Yeah, so as long as you're over the threshold, S is not agnostic about P. In general, no one with a thick confidence whose thickness is less than 1/3 can be agnostic, even if that thick confidence has a middling midpoint. Yeah, I mean, you don't get to be agnostic just because you have doubts. You still have an opinion. That's fine. There is a serious question now about what to say about the coarse-grained attitudes of these sorts of subjects. If my credence that my ticket will win the 2-ticket lottery or that the coin will come up heads is 50%, then force-wise I'm attracted to and repelled by these propositions to equal degree, with no neutral force in the picture. Yeah, so you've got exactly equal circle and triangle options here, and squares disappeared. So we know this can't be suspension of judgment according to the FBL theory. It's also hard to see how it could be belief or disbelief given that neither of the pro or con forces dominate and both forces are equal in strength. So none of these. If my credence is 50%, then I don't have any coarse-grained attitude according to FBL. And we will have to say mostly the same thing about the middling thick confidences mentioned in the last paragraph. For instance, of all those, if you take all those numbers again, but they're equal to 0.4. Again, this seems to rule out all coarse-grained attitudes. You see, this is a problem. Once you start assigning numbers to everything, then you can just, you have the exact number for everything, and it doesn't seem like very fuzzy anymore, which is odd because the person was saying, it's okay to have these fuzzy things. But once you assign numbers to everything, it stops being fuzzy. And that's what the complaint was back at the beginning I had too. It's like, you can assign numbers to all the things and you can assign numbers to the fuzziness. And that's exactly what this author here did for the against what the book person was saying. So this is like these strategies people have. You have to understand, it's like, you can do this stuff. It's like, why didn't you do this? Like, why didn't you think that? And that was one of the complaints the author of this paper had for the book. Okay. While there is something strange about having to say that subjects like these have no coarse-grained attitudes, come on, work this time, I think that the heart of that strangeness is that we have to say that they are not suspending judgment. If my credence that my ticket will win the 2-ticket lottery is 50%, it's innocuous enough to say that I don't believe I'll win and that I don't believe I'll lose. But why can't I be suspending judgment about whether I'll win or lose? In replacing CBL with FBL, we've gone from a view according to which suspension of judgment largely occupied the middle of the unit interval to one according to which it's largely banned from that middle. While I'm sympathetic to complaints about CBL's account of suspension of judgment, I don't think this is the right reaction, or at least it's not the one that gets the sort of neutrality that is central to suspension of judgment. I can rationally suspend judgment about whether that fair coin will come up heads. You can suspend judgment. See, this is one of these real difficult things in probability. What are we talking about? Are we talking about the options the coin has, or are we talking about the future in the world? The coin clearly has heads and tails. The future of the world, however, is uncertain whether the coin lands on one of those sides. So you can suspend judgment saying, look, I don't know which way the coin is going to land, but I do know it's going to be heads or tails. And that's kind of what we're trying to capture here, the fuzziness of the future, even though we know both options. Now, of course, the universe could explode before the coin lands. You could like flip the coin up in the air, like coin's up in the air, blah, 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 flip, 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 and then the sun explodes and it hits us before the coin gets down. And so in some sense, the coin did not land heads or tails. But that doesn't change that it's perfectly clear that there are only two options, heads or tails. So this is part of the difficulty in probability, that once you preset the options, they don't go away. All right. But like the author has a point here that if the book is unclear about this, there is something unclear here. And so it's like, I'm not faulting this author for this complaint, but like this is a tough problem within how you describe probability to begin with. Okay. While Sturgeon doesn't directly address this sort of concern, yes, here's the thing. It's like, this is a fine point in understanding probability. Okay. While Sturgeon doesn't directly address this sort of concern, he does speak to it in his general discussion of the associated suspension of judgment with his neutral force. There he says, quote, "Suspended judgment is a kind of considered reserve. Yet the hallmark of reserve is a refusal to take a stand, yea or nay, wise, so to say, on the truth of a claim. Yet nothing like that seems to be involved with any level of credence, for they all seem to involve an exact spread of confidence across every niche of epistemic space. Being 50% sure that it will rain, for instance, is tantamount to a thumbs up for rain in half your epistemic possibilities and a thumbs down for rain in the other half. There is no such hesitation or reserve in that, so it looks as if credence as such, and thus middling strength credence, is something rather the opposite of suspended judgment, rather than anything which could make for such judgment. Since credence involves a pro or con stance across all of epistemic possibility, just like a truth value, it is the wrong sort of thing to make for suspended judgment." You know, fair enough, but you could have go dialetist, have overlapping possibilities then. What would that be? Not dialethism. It would be diastemic. You know? I feel like I should write that down. Diastemic. Like diepistemic. Because just, that's a fun enough word. See, that's fun enough that that word itself would get I could write a paper and get it not published, but that's good enough for a section of a paper. Having overlapping epistemologies, like you have overlapping truth values in power consistent logics. But anywho, yeah, because you have a power consistent epistemology. Then I wonder if someone's done that. They probably have. All right. Anywho, it's something to look up, and if you come up with a cutesy name, that's good enough for a section in a paper. Alright, continuing. And how much more of this have we got? We are on page 11 of 14, and it goes, okay, so 2.5. Yeah. If Sturgeon is claiming that S's actually having credence of 0.5 in P is a matter of S's having various less middling opinions about P in their epistemically accessible worlds, then I'm not sure why we should accept that. Less controversial is the claim that part of what it is for S to have a credence at 50% in P is for it to be the case that half of S's epistemic possibilities, epistemically accessible worlds, are ones in which P is true, and half are ones in which it's false. But it's not clear to me why that is incompatible with reserve or hesitation. Quite the reverse. Saying that some epistemically accessible worlds are P worlds and some are not P worlds seems to me one nice way of representing my actual reserve. Both P and not P are epistemically open. The matter of whether P is not settled for me, both answers are live options for me. But even setting this aside, as we've already seen, Sturgeon's account rules out some imprecise confidences incompatible with suspending, for example, from 0.4 to 0.6. Why this should be is not clear, even if we accepted the above argument. Okay. It's like, yeah, if you're saying everything is going to be, everything's, all the possibilities are already laid out in front of you, and half of them are one way, half the other, it's either are they exactly all laid out in front of you, or is that a cause for hesitation that you're not exactly sure what's going on. See, it's in the interpretation of the situation going forward, as I was saying earlier about what is the world going to actually do. It's not a question of what are the options. And so there's actually a deeper question here that this author has picked up on. Okay, continuing. That some thick confidences are not compatible with suspended judgment depends in part on some details of FBL that Sturgeon could, in theory, modify while retaining the basic view. Sturgeon argues that some mixture of forces can only count as coarse-grained attitudes alpha if that mixture is proportionally dominated by the alpha relevant force in the sense I've drawn out. In the case of suspension of judgment, this means we only have suspension of judgment when neutrality dominates in the relevant sense, when there is proportionally more of that force than attraction or repulsion. Modifying that constraint could change which fine-grained attitudes count as suspendings. For instance, if we said instead that suspended judgment sprang from the stable mixture of cognitive force, not dominated by attraction or repulsion, then FBL could allow that a subject with a confidence, for example, of from 40 to 60%, is suspending judgment. Yeah, so if you think it's somewhere around the middle, you could suspend judgment. Okay, quote, continuing, but there is a deeper theoretical commitment on Sturgeon's part that pushes him to say that having any credence whatsoever in P is incompatible with suspending judgment in P. While there are some credences that can make for belief or disbelief, no credence can make for suspension of judgment. This is thanks to his identification of the sort of neutrality that is at the core of suspension of judgment with the sort of neutrality that makes a credence mushy or a confidence thick. This sets Sturgeon's FBL apart from a sort of Lockeanism that associates suspending neutrality with neutrality of middling strength credence. But, like other forms of Lockeanism, FBL keeps suspension of judgment tightly hewed not just to something more fine-grained, but to probabilities in particular, just thickness rather than middlingness this time. From my perspective, both FBL and CBL capture interesting ways of being committedly neutral, but neither is identical to the committed neutrality of suspension of judgment. Yeah, see, if you're going to have a metaphysics, you're going to have whatever the metaphysics says. But then you have to also, and this is why I like this author, they are picking up on that you can the experience of people doesn't always conform exactly to particular metaphysics. And so the experience of people is not going to be exactly identical to some sort of committed neutrality that we can talk about. Like, metaphysics are always going to be lacking. You know, they're approximations of what, like, we think the world is like, especially when metaphysics pertains to people. And so it's like, well, is that going to capture the human condition? Usually not. Like, the idea that, like, we're going to capture the human condition, it's like, yeah, you're going to get something of it, but, like, that's not really what we're trying to do in metaphysics usually. Something else. Capture something about the world, something about the human condition. But, like, if you're saying this specifically is what we do, no, we're going to do something else. Like, people are, variable. All right, continuing. Suspension of judgment occupies a somewhat strange place in our epistemic theorizing. It makes up at least 1/3 of the tripartite picture of the doxastic attitudes, or maybe more depending on your view of disbelief. That picture is widely endorsed, making suspension of judgment a central component of contemporary epistemology. But, unlike some other elements of our epistemic theorizing, it is less prevalent in the everyday thought and talk. This means it's a bit more post-theoretical than pre-theoretical, perhaps. Still, we have some intuitions and theories to turn to, and I think those give us some constraints. I don't find a ban on sharp suspending in those. For instance, Sextus talked about suspension of judgment as the appropriate response to the equipollence of the matters in question. Some of the cases in which there are equally credible reasons on both sides are cases in which credence 0.5 is appropriate. More generally, the principle of indifference. Here, finally, we got there. More generally, the principle of indifference recommends creedal symmetry in certain kinds of cases in which evidence is absent. Yeah, this has been around forever. I mean, Sextus is probably Sextus Imperius. I forget. So it's like, these are old things from the Greek. This is where it's come from. In these cases, the same sharp credence for each possibility is permitted, but cases in which evidence is absent are also cases in which suspended judgment is typically permitted. Yes, here's what I was saying earlier. Like, this is the thing. You can do this. A ban on sharp suspending seems to me a ban on suspending at least some cases in which evidence is absent. Less theoretically, our most familiar agnostic is the religious agnostic. Is there any reason to think that this sort of person couldn't be convinced that the chance that their God exists is exactly 50-50 or 51-49 or something else close to that and pretty precise? Having the betting profile and general dispositions of someone with sharp middling credence doesn't seem to me to do anything to make someone less agnostic than a person whose confidence is spread over a wide interval. Perhaps these two agnosticisms have slightly different shapes or textures, but the sharp agnostic is not obviously closer to theism or atheism than the thick agnostic, so in what sense should we say that the former is less agnostic than the latter, or not suspending judgment at all, unlike the latter? In general, both of these characters will give the answer I don't know or I can't say and so on in the expected cases and refrain from the characteristic theistic or atheistic behavior. Sturgeon starts The Rational Mind from a place of realism about the tripartite picture of the doxastic attitudes. Obviously, I've expressed some doubts about whether his account of suspension of judgment lives up to this realism. That said, I hope it is clear that his treatment of suspension of judgment is only one element of his ambitious new picture of our doxastic lives. Sturgeon's force-based account is sure to generate exciting new questions and discussion, but there is a way in which it is the blend of familiar and strikingly novel that is the book's great achievement. One comes away from The Rational Mind feeling as though some basic questions in epistemology and philosophy of mind have been reopened and new ways of answering them have been brought into view. Okay, very nice. And I think the author liked this stuff. It's cool. I mean, I don't think I have a whole lot more to say because, again, this is a book review, and I complained the whole way through. But yeah, I don't have anything like to dig into because as a book review, it doesn't like get into depth in any particular area. I guess I think it's funny that we're rehashing a humor theory of the mind, which has been around forever, basically, into epistemology. Well, not humor theory of the mind. The humor theory was just getting. Now we have an epistemic humor theory. I mean, they're calling it forces, but basically they're doing admixtures of forces, which might as well be admixtures of liquids, which are humors. And so that's like basically what we've got here, you know? So yeah. And you want to know what's funny about this? It's fine. In philosophy, like, that's okay. You can do this. Part of the history of medicine and theory of like knowledge and stuff is going from, like giant like humor theories of the body to reducing it to like smaller areas. Once we understand the mechanisms from certain processes, then the humor theory gets like relegated to parts we don't know as well, and then relegated to the parts we don't know as well again. And so the idea that like the humor theory is wrong, yeah, it's wrong. That doesn't mean it isn't what we do as like a precursor to knowing more about stuff. Like, this is what happens when we're like getting somewhere. A lot of times we're starting to learn things about the area we're talking about, and you start to talk about it in this way. And a lot of times that's kind of how things go. It's like we don't talk, like, you can be out of balance all the time. And out of balance in terms of like your chemical like imbalance in your brain, like you've got like your like whatever nutrients are out of balance. These are all sort of liquids and like proportions. These are all thoughts that we have. And it's like this sort of thought is how we actually do a lot of our sort of just general thinking, like our folk thinking. And so the idea that like this is like terrible, it's not. Is it going to fly in the long run? No, it's probably not going to fly in the long run either. But like, this is what people do. Like, smart people, this is how they understand the world. Oh, got an itch on the outside of my shoulder. And like, they kind of like, they make stuff up, and like they use these sorts of systems to think about the world, and they don't think about them in the wrong way. But it's like, is it going to last forever? No, people are going to move on. But okay, that's it for that.